Hello, this time on Sitrep.
Nothing can replace America's nuclear umbrella, the ultimate guarantor of our security. Europe needs to know that Uncle Sam still has our back.
But many are not convinced Uncle Sam does still have our back. Eastern NATO allies have asked France for shelter under its nuclear umbrella. Poland's Prime Minister even talks about his country pursuing its own nuclear weapons. So as America steps back and trust in its commitment to protect Europe is shaken, we explore whether Europe could and should go it alone on nuclear deterrence.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Nuclear weapons and capability were front and centre through the Cold War. For 3 decades since, they have been much more in the background of defence. But they're right in the spotlight once again, Mike.
Yes, partly because of the conflictual nature of global politics at the moment. Also because the Russians lose no opportunity to rattle their nuclear weapons, at least rhetorically. They haven't actually done very much about operationalizing anything apart from the new things they're bringing on stream, but they were going to do that anyway. But they've raised the temperature of nuclear politics to the point where the Chinese and the Indians have been telling them to cool it, not to do that. But the other thing is that whereas during the Cold War, the whole nuclear debate was surrounded increasingly by an arms control structure, which created predictability and a certain sense of reassurance, although these are, terrible weapons, that predictability seems to have worn thin and the structure around them has been gradually dismantled. So we're back to, as it were, naked power politics with a lot more nuclear weapons now than the last time we had naked power politics in the late 40s, early 50s. So I think that's the difference.
And Mike, nuclear weapons are talked about as the ultimate insurance policy, with the concept of mutually assured destruction, the bluntest and most undiscriminating of weapons. But behind that, the systems and thinking are incredibly complex, aren't they?
Oh, yes. There's a whole industry, of course, not just in the technologies of nuclear weapons, but also in thinking through what they're all about. Some of the earliest theoreticians of nuclear deterrence, none of them spoke Russian, incidentally. But they were mathematicians and meteorologists. They were scientists who were interested in the logical problems that the idea of total destruction created. And there is a sort of theology of nuclear deterrence, which I always found very difficult to accept, to be honest. And I've lived my life, as we're arguing with that theology. But there is some value to it for sure. But it's a very complex subject that has sort of gatekeepers of the mystery. And the problem now is that we're in a situation where we've got to think more clearly and in a way in simpler terms about what these weapons do and what strategies might be arrived at for at least deploying them, if ever, or not for using them.
OK, well, we have some explaining to do before we can start to search for answers. And so with us is someone who understands the detail very well. William Alberque is a former director of European security at the US Department of Defense. After that, he became director of NATO's Arms Control Disarmament and WMD Non-Proliferation Centre. He's now a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Centre, and he joins us from Berlin. William, great to see you again. Thank you for joining us. You've worked in non-proliferation for more than 25 years now. It can feel like we might be at the start of a new arms race, do you think? What is your take?
I don't think we're at the start of a new arms race. I think we're in the middle of an arms race. To me, Russia began arms racing back in 2003 when, after the U.S. pulled out of the ABM treaty and started the Second Iraq War, and the price of oil spiked, President Putin understood better than most leaders the value of nuclear weapons as a sort of an icon of a superpower, but also as a tool of coercion. And so they started prioritizing amongst their entire military funding the rebuilding of their nuclear strategic, but also operational and tactical nuclear weapons across the board to give themselves all kinds of nuclear options. We also believe that China has been thinking about arms racing since the 2000s and probably initiated these process during the 2010s because, recently we noticed that they had been building hundreds of silos, but one doesn't simply make that decision overnight. These decisions have been going on for a long time. So actually, the West is sort of catching up with an arms race while it's already in progress.
Interesting. And the key phrase is nuclear deterrent. How damaging are questions now about US commitment to that deterrent and the effect on Europe?
Well, it is really damaging because I think, I want to go back to something that you said at the very opening of this episode. I think Vladimir Putin understands better than anyone that in order to really maintain his standing, as Russia's sort of economics aren't very good, as their demographics aren't very good, he wants to return to the 1950s, to a period of risk and conflict. He doesn't feel like positive sum outcomes are a real possibility in international politics. At the same time, you have Donald Trump, who is sort of returning to an American sort of disruptive America First policy, which we last saw in the U.S. in a big way with President Nixon, a small echo of that with George W. Bush. There's been this undercurrent in the United States about sort of withdrawing from the world and focusing on itself. And so I think Putin and Xi are taking advantage of that. But Donald Trump is exacerbating that by really, really disrupting the alliance relationships, which have provided Europe and the UK with enormous amounts of stability over the past few decades.
So, Mike, as things stand, the US and UK nuclear deterrents are effectively planned through NATO. France is currently not a NATO capability. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, that's it. I mean, American nuclear weapons have always backed up the nuclear deterrent that NATO embodies. And within that, I mean, Britain very close to the United States in the way it developed its weapons and the way it operates its weapons. But British nuclear weapons are devoted to NATO. But of course, they can be used in the national interest only if necessary. Nobody could quite foresee how that might arise without other members of the alliance being threatened. And France takes the view, or has traditionally taken the view, that its weapons are only for its own defence. So it's basically the United States, Britain with a NATO commitment, France with a national commitment only. But the fundamental thing is there are three decision-making centres, Washington, London and Paris. And what keeps NATO's deterrent alive and credible, it is said, is the fact that any aggressor has got to take account of three decision centres rather than just one. So even if the United States were not involved, I mean, that's a big if, of course, these days. But if they were not involved, and it's always been assumed they would be, there is still what would London and Paris do? And then you get into all the theology, as I was talking about, of extended deterrence. I mean, Bismarck famously said, international treaties are like sausages. You shouldn't investigate what's in them too much. Don't look at them. Just eat them. And treaties are like that, and nuclear treaties are like that. Don't get inside them. Just take them as for what they are. Because once you start to dissect them, you won't really like what you find inside.
Well, let's dig into the detail without finding out exactly what's inside those sausages to assess the options for Europe now. Just to give a very rough illustration of how our nuclear deterrent compares with others, I'm just going to bring in Sitrep's head of spreadsheets, James Hurst. James, follow that. Before you do the numbers, you've actually been on one of those submarines, haven't you?
Yeah, and invited on board 9 years ago with then Defence Secretary Michael Fallon. And, we've seen within the last week or so the Prime Minister and Defence Secretary Keir Starmer turning up on one of Britain's nuclear-armed submarines. Politicians do this when they want to send a message, when they want to be seen there. Back in 2016, Michael Fallon was pushing the case for a renewal of the current fleet of Vanguard-class submarines that carry our nuclear weapons, and visited HMS Vigilant at Faslane and took a bunch of journalists on board because they want to be seen. They want to remind the world about the nuclear deterrent that Britain possesses, and that's exactly what Keir Starmer was trying to do this month. I mean, it's slightly surreal because actually, having been on board lots of Navy ships before, in a sense, it kind of feels like one of those, but you're constantly below decks. The sort of centerpiece for the journalists of this was the safe which holds a red trigger on a big curly cable, and you look at it and you just go, it's got to be more complex than that. And of course it is. But also you get a tour of the submarine, and this is where I'll take myself to the spreadsheet. At the heart of the submarine are 16 giant metal tubes. And each one of those can hold a nuclear-armed missile. Each one of those Trident missiles can carry 12 warheads. So what's I can't even do the maths. What I know is we carry significantly fewer. So we were told, and it's been repeated many times since, that the one boat that is always on patrol will have 8 missiles, so only half of those tubes filled, and it will carry a total of 40 warheads. So each missile will be at 5 warheads compared to the 12 it could. But if you look at our stock of warheads, if you want to consider compare it in the world, the UK has, we think, 225 warheads. We were looking to reduce back in the 2010 Defence Review. The 2021 integrated review put us back on an upward track and said that we would move to an overall stockpile of no more than 260 warheads. The people who assess these things don't think we have actually moved up to that, but the UK now deliberately retains some ambiguity on those numbers.
And how does France compare, James?
So France, if we go on raw numbers, 290 warheads. They've got also 4 submarines, similar capability, but they've also got some small air-launched nuclear capability. So they have got 50 warheads that could be launched from land aircraft, or 10 of them could be launched from carrier base. And I major on the warhead numbers, but it's also about the delivery systems. That means they've got a more flexible capability there.
We'll have a chance to talk about that in a little moment. But what about the rest of the world, James?
So let's go back to my headline numbers of warheads. The US has 3,700. And these are their active stockpiles. It excludes retired ones that theoretically could be brought into use. Russia, 4,380. I mean, we're looking at 20 times the size of our capability there. China's got about 500, so that kind of equivalent of UK and France together. And then you've got sort of smaller powers like Pakistan and India on around 170 warheads each. The interesting thing with the US and Russia is not only do they have submarine launched, not only do they have air launched, they also have land-based missiles that can carry nuclear warheads. US thought to have around 400 intercontinental ballistic missiles that can carry warheads. Russia, 320 something. China also, and they have these. The point is, land, sea, and air. They've got even greater capability, flexibility in how they might launch nuclear strikes. And that more than the raw number of warheads. What you were saying earlier about it being mutually assured destruction, that's the number of warheads, but the complexity is the options you've got to make use of them, and that complex, and that fits into that really complex theology that Mike was talking about earlier.
Well, let's explore that a little bit more, Mike. Aside from the fact we look at ourselves like absolute minnows compared to Russia, can you explain the triad principle and why it matters?
Yeah, I mean, the triad is being able to deliver missiles by air, land and sea. And there are different pluses and minuses, pros and cons of each of them. So land-based missiles, things in silos in the ground, they can be the biggest and the heaviest, the most sophisticated, like the Minuteman III that the Americans have got. On the other hand, they're in the ground. Everybody knows where they are. And the enemy certainly knows where they are. So they're potentially vulnerable. In the air, you've got more flexibility because it's delivered by an aircraft, and the air you could be delivered by carriers, as the French have got, and the Americans. So you could launch from an aircraft carrier, aircraft which would carry smaller air-to-ground missiles, nuclear bombs, and so on. So smaller load. I mean, famously in the 1950s, the United States had Strategic Air Command with some aircraft circling around 24 hours a day above their bases. This was the famous basis of failsafe and the famous film that we've mentioned many times on this program, Dr. Strangelove, that aircraft were in the air circling around all the time, bombed up, ready to go in case there was a sudden attack. And, there are flexibilities about air delivery, but they're quite vulnerable. The most invulnerable of all are sea-based on submarines, because so far nobody has actually devised a way of tracking submarines in the deep ocean. So any submarine carrying its weapons is pretty invulnerable to detection. But as we go through this century, you can bet your life there's an enormous amount of interest in whether anti-submarine warfare suddenly makes a step change in capabilities. It's been on the verge of a step change for the last 60 or 70 years, and it never quite happens. Believe me, if it does start to happen, it will change the calculations, because the idea is generally that submarine-launched ballistic missiles are far and away the most invulnerable, the safest sort of deterrent to have. But again, there are inflexibilities about the fact that you've got submarines, they've got to stay submerged, there's a limit to how many they can carry and so on. So air, land and sea, all have got their advantages. If you had to opt for only one system, you would almost certainly opt to what the British have got, and the French also share, and the Americans, of course, which is sea-based. And we have our 4 submarines, ballistic missile submarines. The Americans, I think, are running 11 at the moment, or either 10 or 11, I think. And that's regarded as adequate to maintain invulnerability. That's the advantage.
William, presumably nuclear planners have a set of planning assumptions, like a script for how they would expect a war to unfold after someone fires the first nuclear weapon. What does that look like from your experience?
Sure. I think the fact is, as we were talking about before, nuclear theology is by nature kind of a closed art, because basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to instill fear in the other side. If they attack you, they're going to be damaged so badly that it's not going to be worth attacking you in the first place. And how do you measure that? How do you measure whether or not you have assured your adversary that you're going to actually hit them? It was actually a UK Minister of Defense during the Cold War, Dennis Healey, who said that real deterrence with the Soviets is 5% capability to deter them and 95% assuring the Allies that we'll actually go to war for them. In that circumstance, how do you actually know what will happen in a conflict? People like to think that there's some kind of automaticity, that, as you said, there's a playbook. This happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. It's not really the case. Yes, you try to plan that way. You try to think things through. If the Russians use a tactical nuclear weapon in this situation, how would we respond? How would we restore deterrence? How would we win in the conflict? How would we make sure we don't acquiesce? But ultimately, it comes down to the leader of the country deciding the most important decision they could possibly make, which is to use the deadliest weapons possible that could result in the annihilation of Earth if the Russians or the Chinese or the Indians or the Pakistanis or whomever were to use all of their nuclear weapons. So there is no automaticity. There is no set playbook that if the Russians do this, we'll do that. Or if we do that, the Russians will do that. And in fact, what we're seeing in Ukraine is President Putin himself is trying to use our fear of nuclear weapons in order to make us not do things that we want to do. For instance, supporting Ukraine. Remember, if we gave Ukraine battle tanks, Russia might escalate. And what does escalation mean? Well, they might use nuclear weapons. If Ukraine attacks Russian territory in Kursk, Russia might use nuclear weapons. This was Putin trying to instill fear in us. And again, that's why nuclear deterrence seems like some sort of closed box. If you really look at how it's done, it really is about confidence. It really is about how do we make sure that we think, our allies all think that we're going to use nuclear weapons to defend them, that our population thinks that these will be used only for good. How do we convince the adversary that they will not get away with bad things? So a lot of this is about psychology, but ultimately nuclear weapons have sort of kept the peace, but they don't provide you with all the outcomes that you want in every situation. And again, you go back to, okay, what do we think would happen if, for instance, Russia were to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine? Again, as we said earlier in the broadcast, even India and China got nervous about that, because if Russia were to use nuclear weapons in a conflict, it may be that the United States then chooses to intervene in the conflict. It may be that the US, UK, and France choose to intervene to punish Russia so that it doesn't get away with using nuclear weapons. And then does Russia escalate further and further and further? So there are very smart people who try to game this through, but ultimately there's a huge amount of uncertainty. And you go back to one of the seminal papers about nuclear weapons theory is called, I think it's by Tom Schelling, and it's called The Threat That Leaves Something to Chance. Ultimately, you have to convince your adversary that it's not worth the risk to directly attack you. And so that's the chance. If you define it too precisely, if there's too much automaticity, then we're either on the path to war, or your threats are not credible at all times. So you have to leave a certain degree of chance. And that's why, I'm sorry, I can't give you a precise answer. And it's one of the reasons why this community seems like it's some closed priesthood of super theory, when really it is just smart people trying to think through, how do I convince bad guys not to do terrible things?
And in that event, that terrible thing happens, Mike, a nuclear war scenario, what can Britain do?
Well, in that situation, it could either do nothing. It could choose to not reply with nuclear weapons. And that's one of the things that, every prime minister within the first 24 hours of becoming prime minister has to sit down and write the letter of last resort, which is the letter that goes on the submarines, and to the submarine captain, which is to say, if all communications are broken and you honestly believe that this country has been attacked, then you read this letter. And this letter will tell you what you should do. Now, we never know what prime ministers have said. We've tried to guess, but nobody knows. And those letters are destroyed, completely destroyed, once the submarines come back, or once the letter becomes irrelevant and the prime minister changes or whatever. So the letters of last resort are there. So you could choose to do nothing. You could say that whatever has happened, it'll only be worse if we retaliate. Or Britain could choose to use its weapons in a NATO context. And the fact that we've only got one boat on patrol means that if we used our weapons tactically, and we could use them in as very small weapons, actually, although they carry, big warheads, literally, 100 kiloton warheads or more, we could actually fire an unboosted primary of 1 or 2 kilotons or 4 or 5 kilotons, which would be pretty small by nuclear standards, but using them in a tactical way would reveal where the boat is. So the fact is that if we've only got one boat available and it uses its weapons in anything less than a strategic environment, then it would reveal itself, and that's not a very attractive idea. So ultimately, Britain, we've had angels dancing on pinheads for years over these issues. Ultimately, we say our nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent. They are the absolute last resort, and the opposition don't know if we'll use them or not, and that's as far as you can ever go. It's either there or it isn't, and it would depend on the Prime Minister or the boat captain on the day.
Yeah, and you say only there or it isn't, and we only have one boat at sea at any one time, one shot. But could we have more than one boat at sea in a high tension situation, William?
Yes, actually, so there have been crisis situations. For instance, at the start of Russia's war in Ukraine, France actually put more of its submarines to sea than it had at any time during the post-Cold War environment to send a signal. Now, there's availability in terms of what ship is undergoing refurbishment or repair at the time, but you could see in an emergency situation that the UK would be doing its best to make sure that as many of those 4 submarines are available as possible. I did also want to add there, if you want to see something amazing, there's a Yes Minister sketch, or a part of the Yes Minister show, where the National Security Advisor is talking to the Prime Minister and walking through different use scenarios. And it is very funny, but it's also very illustrative of what a difficult question this is. Do you retaliate? Do you use nuclear weapons now? Is this the circumstance, or is this not serious enough a circumstance? Ultimately, the Prime Minister would never be so alone hopefully, would never be that alone to be making those decisions. And so the UK relationship with NATO, the UK bilateral relationship with France, and hopefully the continued relationship with the United States means the Prime Minister never makes that decision in isolation. But it is the hardest decision that a Prime Minister would ever have to make. And that note of last resort that's written for each Prime Minister, just a terrifying thing to have to go through to say, here are the circumstances where a commander of a UK submarine would have to take that decision, would have to look at his crew, look at those tubes, each one of which, with a deadly missile on it, and make that decision to launch those missiles and do the unthinkable. It's really an extraordinary thing, but again, necessary for the UK, necessary for the NATO allies, and it's kept the peace so far, and I think it will continue in the future.
Yeah, Kate, it's generally thought that letter, goes through four options. The prime ministers are advised. Look, you could offer one of four things or some combination. One is do nothing. Two is launch as normal, just launch as planned. Three is put your boat under the command of the nearest allied country. So it might be America, it might be Australia. Give yourself to a friendly country's command if our command has gone out. Or the fourth one is make your own decision. Do what you think best. And so it's often said that the letter ranges across one of those four things.
Yeah, I don't really like number four, to be honest with you. But what you were shaking your head a bit, William, on question number 3, handing over to the nearest ally.
Oh, no, I mean, it's absolutely true. It's again, you were talking about such an important consequential decision. You can imagine a situation where the UK itself has been attacked, where London might be destroyed. And so the submarine, would pull into an allied port and declare itself as a friendly asset for that country. And you think back to World War II, where there were situations where, for instance, the French Navy was in a foreign port and had to decide what to do. These are really tough questions, and they're illustrated by historical examples. These aren't isolated questions. And we may be moving to a period of conflict now where we have to re-educate ourselves. It's one of the reasons I applaud you for doing this podcast. We have to re-educate ourselves, because in the Cold War, at least, all the people were more informed. Some people were very well informed. And as you pointed out, over time, we just stopped really talking about this in public. And we really need to raise our IQ on this topic.
Interesting to hear your perspective on this, Mike, because you've advised ministers coming into post. How well informed are they generally? And what is the most important thing they need to understand about our nuclear capability on day one?
Most ministers I know of don't know much about the specifics of nuclear deterrence or of the force that we have. But they all have an intrinsic understanding, a natural inbuilt understanding, that these are terrifying weapons which would only be used in the most dire of circumstances. And anything less than that, any game playing to gain advantage in a crisis in the way that Putin is trying to do, is deeply, deeply irresponsible. So I have a sense that all ministers come in with a bedrock understanding of nuclear explosive power, but are pretty hazy, generally speaking, about who's got what and how they work and what the arguments are. And again, I have been informed that in his first term, President Trump did not know until he was told halfway through his first term that Britain was a nuclear power as well. He didn't know that. He'd been a president for 2 years before he found out.
William, let's educate a bit then. In a nuclear war scenario, what can Britain, capability-wise, not do?
Well, so Britain has submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and these are all relatively high-yield warheads. In theory, before the ship departs, you could do things to alter the yield of that warhead. It's a lot more difficult once it's mounted on. So we're really talking about a strategic asset. This is an asset designed to take out very important Russian command and control bunkers, or very, very, very large military formations, or incredibly highly valuable targets, like maybe a Russian carrier group, something like that. This is not designed for a surgical strike on, a small unit, a military unit in the field. This is really designed to deter Russia. So this is designed to inflict strategic damage so significant that it would make Russia reconsider taking any kind of action, or even would make it give up in a conflict. So we can't think of Britain's deterrent as something that provides lots and lots of flexible options in terms of what it can damage. It's not designed to do every mission. And that's because the UK used to have tactical nuclear weapons. It used to have airdropped bombs, actually a WE-177, I think it was, a UK designed and built airdropped bomb that could be used for much more flexible missions. And during the height of the Cold War, the US gave the UK a number of nuclear weapons, including artillery systems. The UK was also developing some of those systems, but it was easier to use the US systems. It was looking at air-launched cruise missiles, it was looking at ground-launched missiles, all kinds of flexible options to do more. And that's the big debate that's happening now, is in order to maintain NATO deterrence, if the US is less committed to NATO, does the UK need to provide more options than just the giant strategic benefit that the submarine-launched ballistic missiles provide? And that's a debate because even replacing the submarines and replacing the missiles and replacing the warheads, which is what's underway right now, is going to cost so much money. Can the UK afford, does it have the manpower to design new warheads and put them on new systems? That's a really big question that is in the forefront of a lot of European capital leaders' minds today.
And William, can you just briefly explain the difference between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons?
People wrap themselves up in this question a lot. It's a really simple question. Strategic means defeat of an entire nation. Operational means a continent or a very large area of warfare. Tactical means a battlefield. So you could have a tactical warhead that's very large. You could have a strategic warhead that's relatively small. The size doesn't matter. It's what the intention is. A strategic nuclear weapon is designed to deter or defeat Russia. An operational nuclear weapon is designed for a theater battle, like across Europe, to try to settle the battle on that level. A tactical nuclear weapon is designed to defeat a small unit, so a battalion or a brigade or something like that. That's how you think about it. Tactical is a battlefield commander, operational is a theater commander, and then strategic is your national level deterrent.
And Mike, what could France add to our nuclear capability?
Well, France has got more flexible weapons. I mean, they've got a different sort of program because ours is so close to the United States program and has been much better for it and cheaper. France has done it the hard way, but they've got air-delivered weapons. They can operate from carriers. They used to have ground, silos in the ground, sort of ground launch weapons, but they got rid of them. And they've got their submarines, their 4 submarines. So France has got actually a more flexible weapons set if we're thinking about French nuclear deterrence being extended to other European partners. That's more plausible for France than it is for us. It's not impossible for us because, as William said, I mean, part of it's credibility. If we said that our weapons are at the disposal, in principle, of Germany or Poland if they're attacked, then that's what we say. And it wouldn't be impossible for us to make some of our aircraft nuclear capable using warheads, and we might cooperate with France on that. I mean, those technical things, they're not cheap, but they're not impossible to do. And France, because it's gone its own way, has got a bit more flexibility in its force structure than we have.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So France has air-launched cruise missiles. They call them A-SAMPA-A, extended range. And right now they're in the midst of building a new advanced one that's stealthier and faster, can go up to Mach 7. And I think it's BMDA who's working with them on this. And the UK and France have had air-launched cruise missile conventional side cooperation in the past. And at Lancaster in 2010, the UK and France signed a treaty to do nuclear cooperation. And there's actually a facility that the UK and France have built together in France to help with warhead surety, to make sure that the stockpile stewardship is working well and safety and security are working. So you could see, in theory, French-UK cooperation on this new generation air-launched cruise missile, design it to go on UK and or NATO aircraft. Then NATO works together with the UK to have warheads built by the UK under possession of the UK, available to the NATO alliance to provide NATO with a more flexible option as part of NATO planning, because the UK has no problem with planning with NATO, whereas France likes to keep its planning completely separately. So then you have France with sub-launched ballistic missiles for strategic effect. You have the UK with sub-launched ballistic missiles with strategic effect, but the option of smaller warheads for tactical fight as well. Plus air-launched cruise missiles from France, which, again, they're trying to be more reassuring to allies, but it'll never quite get there. But the UK with an air-launched cruise missile capability that it could share with allies to provide security. So you could have an offset. Instead of 100 B-61 air-dropped bombs by the United States as the embodiment of its NATO nuclear deterrent, actually a flexible UK and French supplied air-launched cruise missile force could provide more options, more assurance, and help offset any risk of US disengagement in the future.
So does this mean, Mike, that France is more than a one-shot capability?
Yes. I mean, when we say more than one shot, it depends on whether you're talking about systems which are survivable. Because the whole idea is that if you are attacked first, you have to be capable of surviving the attack and having something to hit back with, so that the opponent doesn't feel that they can destroy all of your nuclear capability in one shot. And that's part of the reason for having a triad. So it's much more difficult for an aggressor to take out everything if you've got it on air, land and sea. So, I mean, French systems are pretty survivable, but particularly their nuclear submarines. The British system is survivable because it's submarines. And the more you can diversify the system, although you lose some efficiency when you diversify, the more you diversify it, then the more survivable it is. So yes, the French, as things stand, have got more than a one-shot capability. And Britain has got more than a one-shot capability. I mean, if our submarines, our nuclear submarines remain invulnerable, as they will for the foreseeable future, but not maybe forever, but if they remain invulnerable, then whatever attack might take place on British forces or the British homeland, our submarine would always survive. And those weapons would always be available to be used or not. I mean, they'd be available, potentially.
So, William, cards on the table, since we seem to be talking about cards a lot these days. Could Britain and France offer a wholly European nuclear deterrent?
Well, yes. Like I said, I think we'll never get all the way to, France sharing nuclear weapons or sharing decision making, but they could do more. Then the UK, if you saw, for instance, like the Atlantic Nuclear Force, which was an idea that happened back in the 1960s, that NATO allies would pay into the UK deterrent, that basically allies would help the UK defray the costs of additional options. And as we're talking about, build a UK air-launched cruise missile with nuclear capability that is then shared with allies, probably at the same bases where the B-61s are in the US airdropped bombs are in Europe, then you could see the UK and France offsetting that part of the deterrent. Now, there's no way to really replace several thousand US strategic nuclear weapons, but with 550, maybe more, maybe if the UK and France increase the number of warheads available to the sub-launch ballistic missiles, maybe if they build an additional few boats, then you really could say to Russia, look, strategically, this is not in your interests. The UK and France and NATO together can do so much damage on the nuclear and conventional level to prevent any conflict from being in your interests, plus the tactical nuclear weapons to prevent Russia from thinking that there's some gap in the NATO defenses. Then you could say that there is a true European component to deterrence that hedges against the risk of the U.S. withdrawing from NATO or withdrawing its nuclear guarantees or diminishing the credibility of NATO guarantees. And quite frankly, even if the U.S. were to reverse course and 100% go in on NATO, I still think European allies should be doing this hard work. For 3 decades, allies have said, we'll leave it to somebody else. This isn't really our problem. We've been on this strategic holiday pretending that Russia and China are just always going to be our friends. And it's only now that we've really realized, number one, the world is much more dangerous than we had hoped. And number two, the U.S. is not necessarily always going to be there. And so this thinking has to happen regardless. But I do think there's a path forward to a European deterrent. Again, whether or not the U.S. pulls out, even if the U.S. stays in, I think the U.S. would be thrilled to see the European allies taking more of this burden and UK taking more leadership in this regard.
So a path towards a European deterrent. But Mike, if Russia massively outnumbers our warheads, will they have that belief that we would strike first?
Well, I don't think they would have a belief that we would strike first, but they ought to have a belief that we would have enough to strike second, so that, in other words, that we would have retaliatory forces. I mean, we would never have an active first strike policy, although NATO did have a first strike policy when it was facing facing a conventional superiority during the Cold War from the Warsaw Pact. But Britain independently would never say whether we retain the right to strike first, but we have a retaliatory capacity. And our forces are relatively small, but believe me, I mean, if 8 tubes, as James said, 8 tubes fire 5 warheads each, even if some of those warheads are decoys, which they almost certainly would be, 40-odd warheads, let's say 30 of them active and 10 of them decoys, I'm just guessing, but something like that. I mean, that's no joke. Whoever you are on the receiving end, that is no joke. And Britain's ability to deliver that, whether it's a good or a bad thing, is certainly technically there and will be there for the next 40 or 50 years.
And just briefly, Mike, nuclear is expensive. How do you measure the value of that nuclear deterrence versus spending that money on conventional forces?
Well, it is expensive and it's hurting us at the moment because we're in the peak spending years of the Dreadnought program. I mean, there are some years when you don't spend a lot at the beginning and then years when the spending plateaus on maintenance and running. But these are the peak spending years when it really hurts. But ultimately, over the course of the whole system, the 31 billion that it's going to cost and plus the contingency of 10, so let's assume it will cost 40 billion, that's going to be about 6% of the defence budget over the course of the whole system up to 2070. So that's affordable. It's a lot of money, but it means that a country like Britain can choose to run it if it thinks it's important enough. And whereas 20 years ago, a lot of people would have said, including me, that probably it's not value for money, actually, I think in the coming era, it will seem like value for money. And I've changed my view on this simply because so much of what we took for granted in the later part of the Cold War has been swept away over the last 10 years and particularly over the last 2 or 3 years. And I say this through gritted teeth, Kate. Through gritted teeth, I am glad that we have retained our nuclear deterrent. And I never thought I would say that, but that's where I am on it.
Yeah. William, when you take a step back and look at the current geopolitical situation, is arms control over?
So I think traditional arms control, the way that we saw it towards the end of the Cold War with on-site verification, very strict verification measures, inspections, all that kind of stuff, is over for the short to medium term. I know that Russia does not want on-site inspection anymore. They want very, very light verification because ultimately they'd like to be able to cheat when they need to. And the U.S., what will the U.S. accept? The first Trump administration tried arms control with Russia and China. China absolutely refused to even come to the table. Russia came to the table, but the whole thing broke down over the fact that the U.S. said we needed verification and Russia said, no, you don't. So on the one hand, I think Trump has a strong interest in trying to put forward his own arms control agreement or arrangement with Russia so that he can claim that he did something better than Obama, that he's worthy of the Nobel Prize. But would we recognize whatever he does as being verifiable arms control that you can really count on, or will it be more rhetorical? And quite frankly, if all of arms control between the U.S. and Russia is gone anyway, would that be good enough? Are we back to, for instance, pre-inspection arms control? So like the SALT agreement back in 1972, which didn't have verification, which was much more of sort of a gentleman's agreement between countries to limit yourself and to continue talking. Would that be good enough in the absence of any arms control? Probably. So I think we're still going to be in a situation where the United States is going to be talking to Russia and China. But even if we talk to Russia and China, as you mentioned before, what about India and Pakistan? India has a real strategic rivalry with China. And as China's numbers increase, India's numbers will increase. So even if you took care of, quote unquote, arms control with China, what about the China-India arms race? What about the India-Pakistan arms race? What about the rest of the world? We tend to think of these things so binary, but actually, what about North Korea? What about all these other places that have nuclear weapons, that have conflict? What about Saudi Arabia? If the U.S. guarantee to the Middle East is seen to waver, if Iran goes nuclear, then Saudi Arabia goes nuclear, UAE. So we can't think of this just as binary. If we get back to arms control with Russia, good. If we don't, bad. The world's a little bit more complex than that and requires a little bit more intelligent leadership. And I do echo the previous statement. I worked on arms control for years, but I do have to recognize that the way that I thought of arms control 20 years ago is simply not applying to the environment that we live in today. And so we do have to think about deterring adversaries. We do have to think about what we need to build up in order to keep ourselves secure. And ride out this current instability and see where we're going to be in a couple of years, and then maybe some kind of arms control structure would make sense. But it has to be more than just US-Russia.
And Mike, final thought, does nuclear capability deter conventional attack, or is it a zero-sum game, do you think, of nuclear only deterring nuclear?
Ultimately, yeah, nuclear should only deter nuclear. And I mean, I've spent a career, watching military planning angels dance on nuclear pinheads over all of this. And ultimately, the things that gives me some comfort in this difficult conversation is the fact that there's a sort of paradox at the very heart of nuclear weapons. We all know if a nuclear weapon were used, then all bets are off. All the planning, all the thinking, all the wargaming, none of it counts. If a nuclear weapon is used, nobody knows what will happen next because it will be such a shock to everybody's system. And that's the paradox, that on the one hand, we know exactly what these things will do. There's no doubt that, nuclear weapons work, and we know enough about the effects of them. So we know what nuclear explosions will do. We know how much destruction they will cause. Nobody's going to be in any doubt about that. So we know what they do, but we don't know what will happen when they do it. And because we don't know what will happen when they do it, because all bets will be off, that in itself is a genuine existential deterrent. Existential in the sense that it's all there, it's always there, whether you like it or not, that's just it. That's the nature of it. And I think we have to take some comfort in that. And as William says, if we can get through the next 10 or 20 years and maybe get back to a framework of arms control, which makes us feel more comfortable about that. But I'm holding on to that thought because we know what they'll do, but we don't know what will happen when they do it. That central paradox is actually a backstop for me on the fact that we probably can get through this next period.
And that is just it for Sitrep this time. But William, that was great talking to you. Will you come back? Because I feel there's so much more we could actually talk about in another episode.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, William. And thanks, Mike. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. Until then, you can always catch up with past programmes you might have missed online at bfbs.com/Sitrep, the BFBS Forces News YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.